for a sec. Okay. Hello, Brain Allies. You are listening to Brains Out Loud, where we talk about important topics surrounding mental health, from our personal life to our work life and everywhere in between. Our goal is that through these conversations, we can help others prioritize mental health on an equivalent level to physical health. This is your co-host, Juliette, speaking, and today we are here with Gabriel Comrie, who is a lovely friend of mine, a brilliant man, and an incredibly talented individual. Gabriel is a business owner and a creative who is passionate about film, digital media, and creating what he refers to as video magic. But with that being said, today we are here to talk about a pretty heavy topic that needs to be addressed and understood in this nation. And that topic is racism, its systematic strategy, and its traumatic impact. Gabriel has helped me understand what I can do better to be an ally at this time in our nation, where white supremacy is flooding our institutions, our streets, our Capitol, and our White House. His knowledge is a gift that I encourage our listeners to receive humbly, and his experiences speak volumes to the privilege that exists amongst white America. Gabriel, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. We are honored to have you here and really excited to have this conversation so that we can get this message out.
Awesome.
So recently we had a conversation about the criminal justice system in this country. Mm-hmm. And through some further research, I came across some shocking statistics. So to share a few, in Washington, D.C., 3 out of 4 Black men will serve time in prison. In major cities in the US, 80% of young Black men have criminal records, and more African American adults are in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. Gabriel, can you speak a little bit to these stats and share with our audience how the white American economy benefits off of keeping Black individuals in prison and how the system keeps individuals in prison or coming back once they've already been incarcerated?
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons why, or one of the largest reasons why, is because they wanted to, in a way, continue slavery. And the way they did that was through the 13th Amendment. And if I could go back, it starts off when they started to figure out the tendencies and likes of Black people based around marijuana back in the early 40s and 50s, when cannabis was actually still legal. In fact, you could go to the store and buy like cannabis milk, you know what I mean? And like, it was like, you could go and buy heroin. It was called laudanum at the time. You could literally go and buy this from the drugstore. Cocaine, all of them, you could literally just go buy it from the drugstore because they were all legal. When at the time, jazz music first started becoming big, it was seen as rap music is seen now. So it was seen as like the music of the devil, and therefore the music of Black people.
Okay.
So when the desegregation kind of happened of schools and everything along those lines, and jazz music started really getting big, and there were a lot of Black jazz artists and jazz clubs that were in predominantly Black neighborhoods. You had a lot of white women looking to get away from their abusive, boring husbands and essentially going to party with the Black folk in the hood. So essentially, when they realized this, or like when white men realized that their women were going and smoking marijuana with these jazz artists, because marijuana was directly tied with Black people and jazz artists, they figured out a way to imprison Black people by making marijuana illegal. So it really actually stems around a lot around that people actually don't realize. The reason for them wanting to demonize marijuana with Black people is because it was an easy way to get them in the system. So if I could jump forward to like now, basically, prisons are a business. When you go into prison, the first thing that they do is they make you strip naked and they take pictures of your body. Um, when they take those pictures, they then put them in a database, and those pictures tell them if any of those tattoos can or are in any way affiliated with gang tattoos. And then they'll ask you also, are you a part of a gang? After they take those photos, they'll then place you in certain pods based off of how dangerous they feel you are. So if a certain amount of Black people have gang tattoos in the prisons, then they have to hire more police officers or control force officers that are catered towards these quote unquote violent individuals. Now, I just have to jump back again for a minute to 1998 when it was admitted by the CIA that in the 50s and 60s, they distributed crack cocaine into inner city areas for the very reason just to be able to police those areas more. The way they did this is they utilized the Italian mafia and other drug cartels, along with drug dealers, young Black men, that they, essentially gave them the drugs and then let them just make the money and then, followed the drugs from there. The reason why they did that is because it allowed them to be able to create a bigger divide between the rich and the poor. So if certain areas need to be policed more, then those areas are considered poverty areas or high risk areas. Therefore, they have to have more police in those areas, but that's a problem that they created essentially so that they could police them more.
Okay.
And that's where it stems back to them wanting to put Black people in jail because, again, the 13th Amendment, legal slavery. So if we're looking at areas like in the south of this country, they keep marijuana illegal because it allows young Black men to easily be funneled into the prison system. So once the Black man is in the prison system, more than likely he has to join a gang. You have to join a gang to be considered safe, for lack of better words. Once you join a gang, then they can charge you for other things in jail, like inciting a riot or starting a fight, which will get you 10 to 15 years on a minimum. And then on top of that, if you accidentally kill somebody or if somebody does die and you were part of inciting that riot, you'll get a murder charge on your rap, and that'll be a lifetime sentence right there. And that's how they keep Black people in prison, by essentially trapping them with small charges. So in the southern states of this country, they actually seek to keep marijuana illegal because it fuels their the economy. And this is all based around money. The prison systems actually create the most amount of jobs for those counties and those areas. So because they bring in the most money, they relieve the most taxes, and they employ the most people, they have the most voting power. So they're going to then be able to elect officials that are going to keep things the way they are, keep marijuana illegal so that they can keep money in their pockets. And again, this is all surrounded, everything about this is surrounded by money, because we as a people are their greatest asset, but free labor is something that, or cheap labor is something that we can't really always rely on in this country. So they can make that happen with the prison system and essentially perpetuating slavery.
So
Now, yeah, because I mean, if you look at China and other countries like that, I mean, they have sweatshops and they operate openly and they have a lot of others, but that's really illegal over here,
yeah.
So, the way around that is the prison system.
And we pretend that we hold ourselves to such a high standard, and we act like we have these laws that prevent sweatshops and prevent illegal labor protocols. But then not only do we actually create those within our prison system, which, one might debate is worse, but we also then utilize those sweatshops and labor forces outside of the country as well. So, it's just typical America being extremely hypocritical and putting their own workers as well as the rest of the world in harm's way.
Exactly. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So I was reading a book that I would highly recommend to our listeners. It is called Breaking Woman, Gender, Race, and the New Politics of Imprisonment. And in this book, it talks about the counseling system that exists within many female prisons, and I'm sure they exist within male prisons as well, but this book is specifically talking about female prisons. And the counseling system that exists is called PHW, and it stands for Project Habilitate Women. And the book discusses how they utilize a counseling system that is supposedly inspired by AA, where they encourage individuals to use a concept called confrontation of self. And this confrontation of self is a system that was created by AA, and this process includes asking individuals to face their alcoholic self or their addict self. And PWH asks women in prison to confront their diseased self. But in opposition to creating a path towards recovery and encouraging participants to socialize and support one another as they do in AA, they use extremely violent and aggressive language towards these women. So they call them horrible names, and they remind them that they have no friends in treatment, and essentially that they're completely alone. And they also encourage them to turn their anger inwards. So when these women are feeling angry at the prison system or angry at the world, they tell them, feel angry at yourself. You're the one that got yourself here. They use terms like crack hoe, whore, say horrible things to these women. And they utilize strategies such as telling these women that they are not real mothers, that their families will never forgive them, and they're not fit to be parents. And this type of approach makes these women feel really isolated, and it gives them less motivation to get out. So they feel that they have no support system within the prison, which makes them angry and frustrated. And then they feel that they have no family that will accept them when they return out of prison. So it's kind of similar to that whole process where the prison system is basically just building a community that creates a cycle. And these women feel like, well, why would I follow the rules, and why would I take these steps to getting out, because I basically have no one that's going to accept me when I get out. And I'm sure that that's one form of keeping these women in. And I'm wondering how in prison systems, once someone gets actually released to prison, not only is it about their family and their community accepting them back in, but also their inability to get a job. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit, and how difficult it might be for a Black person to come out of prison and then seek out an opportunity to restart their life.
Absolutely. I mean, like, I can tell you by direct examples. A friend of mine who was, a long time, friend of mine from high school, who actually, like, after high school, got into some pretty big drug sales, and he got caught with 250,000 ecstasy pills. 100,000, and he actually got caught with 350,000. 100,000 were illegal search and seizure, so he only got charged with 250,000, along with 500 AK-47 parts kits in the state of New Jersey, which are 100% legal, but parts kits, so they were not full receivers, so they were not working firearms, so they were firearm parts.
Okay.
So then when everything actually went down, he was only charged with, at the end of the day, it came to like 3 or 4 different like federal gun charges, which were actually like somewhat minor charges, and then like possession of cocaine and or other substances charge, which was very minimal. So he only received 2 years from those charges that he got. And then on top of that, when he got out, mind you, yes, he's white. When he got out, he was very easily able to get a job as a manager through like kind of like just a system of kind of like quote unquote good old boys, like, you know what I mean, through construction, because they were like, oh, he just got these minor charges, and like, and let's just give him a chance. And he got all the way up to a manager position. Now, here's one of those situations where like it benefited him to be white in that situation, because the judge, it was his very first actual charge, even though it was not his very first time being, doing this. It was his first time getting caught. So that came as like a first time charge. So then the judge kind of went lenient on him because of that. And, they kind of played this card that like, oh, well, his father's sick and he, has been trying to take care of the father's properties and this, that, and the third. And they kind of like forced him into this role. Right. So they were lenient on him because of that. And I guess they gave him like a pretty relaxed charge.
Which is crazy because there are people who are literally in jail serving life sentences for stealing candy bars and stealing hedge clippers without access to parole.
Exactly. There's a man, actually, there's a documentary called The Grass is Greener on Netflix that I suggest everyone watches. It's amazing, and it talks about this direct representation of of tying marijuana to Black people to put them in prison, and a man who has currently been in a life sentence essentially in jail for a joint, because it started with a joint. And actually they explain all of this in that documentary, which is great. They explain actually the cost breakdown and everything. They give you like a nice little infogram chart. And although, when you do watch it, I suggest smoking a joint because it's going to make you upset. I had to pause it for a minute, like for a while. Like I had to pause it and walk away. It was like really that upsetting. It's almost as upsetting as if you've ever seen the Central Park documentary.
Yeah. I had to stop that several times
and
come back to it because it's just so incredibly painful to watch. And it wasn't even that long ago, and things like that still happen all the time. So it's important for people to watch it, though. It's one of those things where it's like, it's painful to get through.
Yep.
And you want to turn it off and you want to live in ignorance is bliss. But we, especially as white people, have a responsibility to watch these things and to make ourselves aware of them.
Exactly. And I think also, just to speak back to like women in general and Black women in general, I think there's probably this, if you've ever heard anything of like, that Louis Farrakhan has said, speaking wise, or even Malcolm X, or Dr. Martin Luther King, the Black woman is the most disrespected woman, the most unprotected woman, the most disenfranchised woman in the world, period. And I think that there's this problem, I think the most with white society, where you have white people usually thinking that, like, if they're called racist, that somehow means that they're like a part of the KKK, neo-Nazi, radical, like throwing the N-bomb, swastikas, hate crimes, lynching type of a thing, like individuals. And that's what, unfortunately, they assume is racism, but that is like overt, obvious racism. There's still this entire like realm of covert racism that's actually worse, that people don't necessarily recognize is racism. And like when it happens, they don't call it out for what it is, and then like kind of like, try to like stop other people from doing it, because it's like, it's that almost silence compliance type of a thing, that where people try to play it off like, well, oh, it's just a joke, I'm just kidding, or like claiming like, things like reverse racism. That's not a thing. It doesn't actually exist. There's either racism can only be a product of the racial majority. It can't be a product of the minority. So if it's from a minority to a majority side, that's called prejudice. Racism can only be from the racial majority, which is white. It's not called Black supremacy. You know what I mean? Like it's called white supremacy. The whole like making America great again. hiring discriminations, mass incarcerations, police brutality, uh, Confederate flags, school to prison pipeline, because that's actually a really big one. Like they practice this thing a lot that I noticed in inner city schools that they don't in non-inner city schools. I went to, let me just give you a little background on myself. I went to a high school that's predominantly white, Bridgewater Raritan High School, and then after I actually did a year at at a at a private school in Hebron Academy. It was what it was called, in Hebron, Maine. So both very majoritively white, predominantly white. At the private school in Maine, I think there was like two of us. There was two black kids. There was myself, and then there's this other black kid. He was kind of light skinned actually, so he was like half and half. And so I was really the only like dark skinned black kid. And then in high school, my graduating class, I think of 750 kids. I'm pretty sure there was about maybe 7 to 8 of us. So you know, I think that there's just so many things when I grew up that I didn't recognize were things that I kind of almost took advantage of, not realizing that do happen in inner city schools, which is this kind of like compliance thing. And they say it now a lot with young kids. They talk about compliance and they use this word compliance a lot, like just comply. Like, what are you talking about? It's a human being. It's not. What do you mean compliance? So, there's that school to prison pipeline issue that is a really big problem, especially in inner city schools, and the way they teach and the vocabulary that they use, that they don't use in white schools. And I'm a testament to that, because I never heard vocabulary like that. Whereas like, in inner city schools, if I went to visit for a day, because I've done that before, you could do that back in, early 2000s. That was a vocabulary word that they used a lot. You know what I mean? So, there's obviously like a list that can go on and on and on about the covert and overt versus overt white racism. But I think the real kind of like issue, or the hardest thing at hand for most people to recognize, is when it's happening and how to deal with it when it's family members, or when it's like people that you really normally wouldn't speak out against, like your boss or something along those lines. And that's where I think it becomes harder, because it's like, all right, well, I'm not really trying to get fired. Do I speak out against this right now to my boss that he's saying something that's obviously racist, or do I not? I mean, a really great example for me was I used to work on Wall Street. I had my Series 7. I worked for an investment firm called Hallmark Investments in Midtown Manhattan. And when I went there for the first day to actually interview, I talked to the manager, the president of the company, and then also the CEO. And one of the other guys just sitting there, he was just standing there, like they were both, all three of them actually, they were sitting across from me, staring at me like this, like they had never seen something before in their life, with their jaws dropped, like their mouths were just open. And I'm like, what are you so surprised by? Like, have you never really seen a black person before? And then the one guy goes, no, we've never seen a black person who speaks so clearly and eloquently before. Where are you from? Like, you don't sound like a brother at all.
Oh my God.
And those are the kind of things where it's just like, that's so racist. What does it mean to sound black? But again, I can attest to it from the other side too, because growing up, I never really got any acceptance from black people, because black people would say to me, well, what do you think, you're white or something? Why do you sound white? Why do you speak white? I'm sorry, I thought I spoke English. I didn't think there was a speaking color.
Yeah.
I didn't think that was it. So, you know what I mean? We keep ourselves divided in a lot of ways, unfortunately. And I think the reason why is because it allows some sort of unity. And I get that, because Ebonics itself is just a language in its own, just like any other language that has its own nuances, and it has its own laws, and it has its own growth to it, just like every language. Every language grows and adapts and changes. There's words added to the English language all the time. So, it's not to say that like that's somehow less intelligent or something along those lines. I think it's just to understand that, for lack of better words, it's just it's a different language in its own. Yes, I can speak it and I do understand it. And unfortunately, because of growing up so almost segregated as a Black person, I learned to code switch. So when I talk to my family sometimes and people just call me out on it, sometimes when I talk to my Black friends, I just speak differently than I do when I speak to white people. And I just learned to do that because it's just what makes the other person comfortable.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah,
And how disappointing that we need to alter the way that we interact with others based off of the way that we think they'll best receive our true self.
right.
And that must be, that must have a pretty heavy weight to play in your sense of worth and your sense of self. And I think, you're talking about your experience of people being so surprised about the way that you talk. And we need to be more aware of microaggressions and how those show up in our workplace and in our communities and our society. And someone was telling me that they were so frustrated because they were just as educated and they had the same amount of experience as their white counterparts in their workplace. I was actually talking to my friend who's a teacher, and she was saying that her white counterparts have either the same education or not even as strong of an education as she did. And when they would speak and they would share information and teach, everybody would just act like it was normal. They were white people teaching. And when she would say something, they'd be like, wow, you spoke so eloquently, or wow, you're so well spoken. And then she would take it offensively. And then they would be like, oh, you're so sensitive, or how is that offensive? And it's because that's a microaggression. Why wouldn't she speak eloquently? Why wouldn't she be well spoken? So I'm sure these types of things show up all the time in various different places. So, I think 72,675 charges of workplace discrimination were filed in the last year. 67% of Black adults cite discrimination as a significant source of stress in their life. And 58% of all adults say race relations in the US are generally bad. So this isn't something that's an infrequent circumstance. And I imagine it must be frustrating. Even I can see maybe how the way I might act surprised or shocked when I learn about these things could be frustrating to the people that are telling me about them, because I think at the end of the day, it's not that shocking, and it's not that infrequent. So I imagine that must be hard.
Right. Yeah. And it definitely is, I think. And, you know, I think probably, and just to touch a little bit more on that, the amount of times that I've even heard from other white women that they have to tame their hair because they have curly hair, because otherwise it's seen as wild. You know what I mean? Like their natural curly hair, even though the curls are very like perfect and like in line with one another, they're not frizzy, curly hair is seen as less tame, right? So it's seen as like, you know, less kept or some odd reason, for some odd reason, like in the workplace. Um, you know, I've the amount of times where I've even had people say something like about, you know what I mean, like, oh, like what are you doing with your hair? You mean like, what do you mean? What are you doing with your hair? You know what I mean? It just grows on my head. What? And you know, and it's like it's funny because like my mom and my parents are even like my mother and my father, they're even like very like kind of almost like starting to have to like tame themselves, I'm sorry, reteach themselves about, you know what I mean, like what is now still like acceptable and how they've even been raced, like, you know, reverse or self, not I guess reverse racism in a way, because like, you know what I mean, being racist towards self, but I mean self racism in the sense that like when I was younger I had locks, like, you know, I call them locks because the like, you know, dread is actually a term that was adopted by Jamaicans, similar to the N word being adopted by rap to try to take power away from the word. They always said that our hair was a dread to look at, so that's why they were considered dreadlocks. but they took the word dread because they made it a lifestyle. So when you're in Jamaica, if you're a dread, it is a lifestyle. It is a way of life. It's a certain personality. It's how you move, how you think, how you are, versus just having locks. Anyone in this country that has those perfect locks, they're called salon locks. They're not dreads. Dreads are natural. Anyway, so I had locks when I was a kid, and my father always said, like, you need to cut your hair. You're never going to get a job. And he wasn't wrong, you know, because like that is seen as unkept. I had to shave all my hair off to be accepted in a workplace, um, all through my 20s. So,
Wow.
yeah.
And something I came across as well while doing some research is that 78% of Black adults agree that being their race is difficult in today's society and in the workplace. And I also learned that Black women are the fastest growing and largest population of business owners and entrepreneurs. And I know you're a business owner yourself, and I'm wondering how your experience as a business owner differs from your experience in a corporate space, and what the pros are, and if you've experienced any difficulties being a Black owned business owner.
Yeah, those are all great questions. You know, I'm not sure exactly because I consider my business still so young. I started it in 2017, and I really kind of only really started it in 2018. So my business is still so young. I really can't say that I've experienced any difficulties necessarily from it. Although because I've done a lot of my research in terms of the proper way for a Black person to have a business. I do think that I've taken advantage of some of the grants and other things in place for first-time Black business owners. Now, that being said, how does it differ from corporate? I can tell you very much that because of the fact that I was in sales a lot of the time. So first, it was my first sales job. I was actually manager of motorcycle sales and lease returns at Baker Chrysler Jeep Dodge in Princeton, New Jersey. And after that, it was like, the job on Wall Street that I was in sales for. And then my next sales job after that was I was a physician's consultant, and on their client and payer relations. I worked for an EMR company, selling doctors basically our billing services remotely over the phone, and handling a lot of other back end services for the doctors, basically putting money in their pocket from the payer side, from the insurance company side. So I think the most interesting thing is when people realize that you are Black, because you can look at my name and you would maybe assume, if you're smart French, Gabriel Comrie, because Comrie is a French or Scottish last name. It's both. Okay. But you couldn't necessarily discern, hearing my voice over the phone and seeing my name, that I'm a Black man. Now, just to go back, reason for that is because when I was born, my mother wanted to name me, I think, Jamel or like Nafi or something like that. She was debating between one of those two names. And my father actually had to say, because he's Panamanian, so he's straight off the boat from Panama. His name's Irving Comrie. So people always assumed him to be Jewish. But he actually said to my mother, quote, and he told me this, he was like, we're not naming our son a nigger name, Barbara. He'll never get a job. And that was the way my parents had to think. So he came up with this algorithm based off of the Fibonacci sequence, and used those numbers that corresponded with my mother's first, middle, and last name, and his first, middle, and last name, and then our my grandmother's name, and his grandmother's and his mother's name. Sorry, so my mother's name and his mother's name, and came up with the name Gabriel based off of that. Because he's like a really big mathematician. So so he came up with like 3 other names, but he decided on Gabriel, and that was the name that, everybody else was just like, all right, fine, Irving. But,
What a great.
in the corporate world, you would read my name and hear my voice over the phone, assume that I'm white, and I would get the interview. And the best part for me was always seeing their face and seeing how they really like took it. Because a lot of the time, like I'd walk in and I'd say, "Hi, how are you? I have I have a meeting today with so and so." And they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Hi, I'm Gabriel." "Oh, Oh, hi." You know what I mean? Because then it's just like,
Yeah.
and you can tell right there that they're like, "Oh, you're black. Wow, didn't even expect that. Caught us off guard."
Yeah.
And 9 times out of 10, still like because of that, I'm very good at um, wowing people when I'm passionate about something, because I can be very passionate about things. So I still would always get the job. I don't think there's ever an interview that I didn't ace. Um, but the only reason why I got the interview was because of those factors to begin with. A, I sound white. B, my name appears white. You know, if either of those factors weren't in place, I probably would not have gotten even half the interviews that I've received. Now,
Wow.
I can tell you that because of social media, it's definitely like harder, because then they can just look you up and then see that you're what your colored skin of your color is. You know what I mean? Color
Mhm.
your skin is, sorry. Um,
That's interesting. So, do you think that LinkedIn and social media has made it even more difficult
I
for
do.
Black people to get
I
jobs?
do. And absolutely. Yeah. And I actually don't like them for that reason. I don't like LinkedIn for that reason. Because it absolutely, I do believe it not necessarily always makes it harder, but you're judging someone based off of an appearance, based off of the posts that they make, based off of things that you might not necessarily agree with, and aren't hiring them for the general merit of who they are as a person and their character, and if they're good at the job or not. You know what I mean? Because that's really what it comes down to. Now, in some situations, you kind of need to. Like, I mean, you don't want to hire a what was that woman's name that they had that they made the law after, Amy so and so in New York.
Oh, oh, I don't know.
The governor made a law after her for if you call the police on someone, like, and they're like, based on just because of the color of their skin, you will get charged. I forget her name. It's Amy something or other.
Okay.
Um, but anyway, um, like, you don't want to hire that type of individual. You don't want to hire the type of individual that has just recently stormed the Capitol, obviously. So like, that's kind of important, right? To like, you know what I mean? Whereas like, yes, it can be like necessary, unfortunately, in this climate of the country that we're in right now. But I think, you know, um, I don't necessarily know that it's harder or it's easier or it's made it worse or better. But what I can tell you is that um, it definitely was easier before 2020 to get work, whereas now it's definitely harder.
Okay.
And I don't know if that necessarily has much to do with it or not, but I can tell you from me personally that I've noticed it's been harder to get work. And I actually had a position for a while with another company that I was working with, and the first time I met the CEO of the company, you could tell he was very shocked that I was black. Um,
Really?
yeah, and nonetheless, I mean, because of COVID, like they went, like, we went for remote, so like, I'm still under 1099 with them, and like, you know what I mean. But like, they definitely don't uh, send me as many projects, and I noticed that right after I met him, and that was still in 2019. That I met him, and they kind of like slowed down on sending me stuff to work on, which I don't know if necessarily has anything to do with me being black or not, but I did notice that it was right after I had met him, and because we spoke on the phone a lot in depth, and I think he was just really shocked that he could not tell that I was black over the phone. Um, so, and I guess, to go back to, the prison record thing, if you're a black man, that you already have that against you trying to get a job, just being the color of your skin, it's definitely against you. uh, Gallup, the polling organization, had college students fill out the exact same application for a job, one writing their actual name and one writing an ethnic name. And 9 times out of 10, their white name got chosen versus the ethnic sounding name. I shouldn't say ethnic because that's even racist to say, the more Afrocentric name.
Okay.
And so, that's just proven alone that, like, it's harder for Black people in that sense of it already. And then if you add on the fact that they also might have a charge, a minor marijuana charge in the state of New Jersey, if you have possession over 2 ounces of marijuana, that is a felony. So you have a felony on your record. If you run from the police because you're afraid of the police, that's a felony. Your second felony that you get, you go to jail. That's mandatory prison time. So that, they make it so terribly easy to put people, Black people specifically, in jail, and then when they do come out of jail, force a system in which they cannot get a job because they are Black, and they now have they're a 2-time felon. That's what it just shows on their record. It shows 2 felonies. It doesn't show what they're for. It doesn't show that they were at a party, possibly, drinking underage, or even there were underage people there, or maybe they were like 20 and they should have been 21 and they just had a couple drinks, but they were drinking and they ran and got caught by some other cops. And now they're underage drinking. They were that's fleeing from the police. That's a felony.
Yeah.
For eluding the police. That's what they call that, eluding the police. It's a felony. And then you can get a felony also if you had, say, exactly 1.5 ounces of marijuana in your pocket in Ziploc bags, because a Ziploc bag is over 1/2 ounce. So they're going to weigh it in the bag. They don't take it out of the bag for you. They weigh it in the bag. Then when you weigh it in the bag, guess what? It weighs over 2 ounces because of the plastic bag. So then that's a felony now. Even though they know that it's less than 2 ounces of marijuana, these are the kind of things that they do, and you know what I mean. And then now 2-time felon, 3-time felon, that's it. You're prison. You're doing at least 10 years for something like you might have just maybe been trying to just smoke some weed. You had some weed on you and you don't have your medical marijuana card. B, because you ran from a cop because you were afraid. And C, let's just say, I don't know, you walked out of the store without paying for something, even though you you bought a whole bunch of other things, just to say you might have just taken a Black person takes a candy bar or something like that, or doesn't have the cash to get everything they wanted at that time, and just kind of accidentally stole it or did steal it on purpose, whatever it might be. Stealing a candy bar, let's just say, that type of thing can right there, just those 3 things right there in the state of New Jersey will put you in prison for over 10 years.
That's really hard to hear. It's disappointing to hear. It's something that we all need to know and we need to recognize. And my white privilege is just rolling through my head all of the times that I was at a college party or a high school party where I was drinking underage, or I was a sophomore in college and the party got busted and we all ran. That's what we did. That was our initial instinct. That's what kids do when they get caught drinking underage. And I know I've talked to you before about experiences where I've been pulled over, where I, was speeding, but I knew that I had a time where my license was expired. And I didn't know that my license was expired. And they were like, we could give you a $600 ticket, but we're going to give you a warning. I know for a fact that a Black person would not have gotten off like that. And it's just so important for us to think about these circumstances when we say white privilege doesn't exist. I have friends and family that say things like, well, I worked really hard for what I have, and I worked really hard to get here, and my parents were immigrants, and we get that, but that's not the point. It's the circumstances in which a white person, a Black person could do the same exact thing, and a white person would be fine, and a Black person would get their whole life and their identity taken away from them. Not to mention the fact that once you go to prison, you no longer have the right to vote.
Exactly.
So not only
or even when you have a felony, you no longer have the right to vote. So you're not really seen as a citizen, even if you come out and they give you these charges, because a felon doesn't have the right to vote either. If you have a felony, you can't vote.
And that's part of the system.
Yeah, and that's all part of the system. Exactly. So you can't get a job, you can't vote, and if you do manage to find some way of making money and getting yourself a car and a driver's license, if for any way, shape, or form, if that exact situation that you just described happened to a Black person, because it's happened to me before, they have in just about any state, they have the right to ask you to get out of the car and search your person. They can legally search your person. If they find anything on you, or if they can't say plant something on you, then they have legal right to search the car. If they plant something in the car or they find something in the car, then you go to jail.
Yeah.
You know.
So, how does it make you feel? So let's talk about mental health for a second and the mental health impacts that systematic racism have and police brutality have and just the culture that exists within America and the world. How does it make you feel when people say all lives matter, or that white privilege doesn't exist?
Um, it makes me think, no shit, Sherlock, all lives matter, but Black lives don't. So we need to say Black lives matter because Black lives don't matter. Um, how that ties in with my mental health. I smoke a shit ton of weed. I have a medical marijuana license. um, I smoke weed to try to like not think about it. And then also like my coping mechanism is like kind of like a little bit like masochistic, where like I work out too hard. Like I work out like extremely hard. I work out for like hours every day, to the point where I'm ridiculously sore. Or like I do extreme sports like snowboarding. I don't just snowboard like the average person. I ride hard. I do really big things. I do things that are very dangerous and kind of slightly, neurotic. Same thing with my downhill mountain biking or my motorcycle racing. I just do those things because it's just that release that I kind of need. And that's what I do for mental health. But I mean, prior to that, it was anger when I was growing up. And I've learned to channel my anger into those things and use it as like a focus. But my biggest problem is that I have like this really weird eidetic memory to like negative things. Mostly I can like, if I even slightly think about a situation that's happened, I can go right back into the feeling of it. It's literally, that's what I actually have my medical marijuana license for, is PTSD. Because even though I've never actually been in any war situations before, because I never was in the military, there were things that had happened in growing up that literally if I talk about and kind of like I can go into a feeling of like reliving that as if it was happening all over again. Um, and there were a lot of those instances in my life growing up, a lot. So because of that, I think my mental health has always had to have been through myself, because anytime when I was even younger going to therapists or anything along those lines, they didn't really know what to say to me. That whole thing where they're not supposed to, like the non-transference factor, is always very hard for many of the people that I spoke with, because they would kind of look at me like, what the fuck? And like really not even know what to say to me. So I still do, talk to a therapist and like, you know what I mean, just to like talk about things and the issues that do happen or that are currently happening. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can use, is talking about it and talking about it with friends and talking about those situations. I've talked about those traumatic instances so many times now at this point, that they're not as traumatic anymore when I can talk about them and not feel as outwardly traumatized all over again talking about them. But at the same time, it's like, I think every Black person has kind of lived or grown up in some way, shape, or form like that. And like now it's kind of at a place where like, when do we get a goddamn fucking break? Because like, every time we see another Black man killed for doing nothing, walking towards the police with his hands up, complying, just complying, and still being shot and murdered, it's just like, it really puts, and just, it really validates the understanding that you don't mean anything to them. So you need to do everything that you can to make sure that you can be above all of that in some way, shape, or form. And that's like really hard. You know what I mean? Like, so like I had to manipulate getting my medical marijuana license so that I could smoke weed and not get in trouble for it, essentially, if I smell like weed, or not get like labeled for it. Like now, luckily, we're in a time where, okay, marijuana is about to be legalized, but I'm 35 years old. That didn't help me when I was 16. You know what I mean? And trying to self medicate because of the stresses of life and everything. You know, I've lost family members to, you know what I mean, police brutality as well. So like, you know what I mean, and then also just gang violence. So like, there's a lot of that type of stuff that just like I think every Black person has to deal with or has dealt with in some way, shape, or form. And I don't know. I think that for some odd reason we must be very, very forgiving, or we have to be, because if white people could even for a minute acknowledge or understand all of those things that we constantly think about and have to go through and emotionally have to go through and live through, then they can understand how to ally themselves in helping us to be able to go through, to, you know, so that they don't happen anymore. And so that like I can feel like I'm safe to have a child and raise a child in this world, because I don't know if I am. You know, I have dogs right now, and I'm, like I said, I'm 35, and I would love to have kids, but I don't trust this world right now enough to have kids. I don't trust this country to have a child, to raise a child in it.
Yeah.
You know, because if something like, you know, Ahmaud Arbery happened to happen to me, if I was Ahmaud Arbery's father, you would hear about me, because I would have gone on a killing rampage. There's no way I wouldn't have snapped. There's no way I wouldn't have snapped. I know, I just know that like I could never handle something like that. So I'm not going to put myself in that situation right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's so many Black people I know for a fact, because I've talked to them, have said the exact same thing to me. You know, and my mother included. You know, she said to me, she was like, if that ever happened to you, I don't know, I would be beside myself. She's like, I don't know what I would do. She's like, someone would have to pay. And like, why not? You know? So,
What parent
uh,
doesn't feel that way about
right,
losing their child? I think every parent feels that if someone took their child's life, then they would need to pay, and they would be angry, and they would be mad, and they would be hurt for the rest of their life. And any
exactly,
parent can relate to that. So white parents need to pay attention to what's happening to Black children.
exactly, exactly, exactly.
And I appreciate you sharing all of that. And I think something you said, you talked about PTSD.
Hmm.
And PTSD is not only something that people who were in combat experience, but 70% of people who experience a traumatic event suffer from PTSD. And the likelihood that we will experience a traumatic event in our lifetime is very high, which means that PTSD is very common.
Hmm.
For people who are witnessing police brutality, who are witnessing people that look just like them getting murdered on the street, that is traumatic. That's traumatic every time you turn on the TV, every time you go on social media. And so to have those feelings and emotions it must be extremely painful and extremely difficult. And I imagine that living in fear, that
Hmm.
you can't do normal activities, go on a run, go on a bike ride, go to the store, or to drive your car, just normal day-to-day activities without having the chance of a police officer or a rampant citizen, white supremacist, killing you, must be a very difficult way to live your life.
Right, and that is like most Black people who live in the South. I mean, like Louisiana, or, you know, Arkansas, or even parts of Georgia. You know what I mean? And like outside of the city of Atlanta, that, you know, that's just the life that they kind of like have to live. And that's like living in a war zone. That's like living in that right there is war. You know, it is a war zone because even for a lot of these inner city, like for a lot of inner city young Black men, if they, for example, um, during that time when the CIA was funneling crack into the Black community, if they lost a parent to drugs because they were always in a crack house, and the only way they could actually take care of their little brother or sister was to sell crack on the street from the dealer down the street, then they had to join that gang. And if there's a rival gang member outside of your street, then, you know, for all you know, like that person could just shoot you one day. So it could be another Black person, or I'm sorry, it could be a rival gang member, or it could be a police officer. It could be a number of other things. And so they absolutely, definitely live in what would be considered an absolute war zone, if you looked at it in any other way, shape, or form. Now, I think there's an understanding also, or a misunderstanding also, about like Black on Black crime. And that would be like a whole nother kind of like large topic to get into, but just to speak on it briefly, Black on Black crime is no different than white on white crime, no different than Spanish on Spanish crime. It's just that like the demographic in the area, because because Black people are usually condensed into certain areas of the country, you're going to see more violence against each other always in those areas. So in predominantly white areas, there's white on white violence. You know what I mean? It's just that it's not categorized as that because they're predominantly white areas, A, and B, they don't really like want to they don't want to label those areas that way, especially in the media. And that has to do with money. I think the biggest prime example of that is, and just again, this will be real quick, but like when I was in high school, there was this thing called, I think they called it like Operation Rags to Riches or something weird like that. It was in the paper. It was this whole thing. And it was like but they kept it really tightly under wraps. And it was very interesting because they got a lot of like elected officials and stuff like that. And then they got all the way down to these dealers. And some of them were actual teachers at the high school. But the thing is like something like that, where it was only in the local paper, and where on the other side of it, in an inner city school, I remember like my cousin went to Union High School, and this kid had brought a knife to school, and I asked him, I was like, oh yeah, like why'd you get sent home from school today? He's like, oh yeah, somebody brought a knife to school. And it was like this whole thing. And then like we watched the news later, and the news had turned it into like, you know, a attempted killing of a teacher, and that he might have also had a gun, and that he was a gang member, and all this other stuff. And the kid just had like a box cutter in his pocket. It was something really stupid, like, you know what I mean? And they tried to make it into like something like way more than it was. And it was
school constantly whipped out pocket knives from their backpack, like literally on a constant basis. And
in inner city schools, they have metal detectors. So like if you have a weapon, or you somehow get past that with a weapon, like then it's just like, you know, like that's even that much worse. So it's like, you know, there's just always that type of a thing still with the media, and with a lot of things where they spin it to try to seem like, you know, things aren't as bad because of like the monetary gain in certain areas. And that's really what it comes down to, is it's just about money and how they charge for property taxes.
Yeah. I had a conversation with someone recently who was saying, well, actually white people get killed by cops more than Black people do.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talked a little bit further about the fact that, well, there's also a larger population of white people in America than there are Black people. So proportionately, that would make sense.
Right.
And secondly, that isn't about senseless murder. A lot of people are killed by police officers because they get into fights with police officers, or because they are dangerous, or because a police officer didn't handle the situation correctly. But regardless, that doesn't mean that police brutality doesn't disproportionately affect Black people.
More.
And to go even further, Surveys and studies suggest that white youth are more likely to engage in crime than people of color. So that makes sense. It makes sense.
Yeah. Hmm. Yep.
It's people love to find useless statistics
Yes, for
that
sure.
mean nothing to defend their claim.
Right. Yeah. And that's exactly what they're kind of like numbers that are forced numbers again, because it's like the amount of times where, the police are called to, and a police report is filed. So therefore, like something is claimed because like some black kids get in a fight on the basketball court over a basketball game and then one of them gets arrested versus like the amount of times that probably happens in a white community are probably the same. It's just that in the white community, they kind of just take them home to their parents,
Right.
and it's not reported. So then so then the numbers seem like crime is not as high. So they can argue that crime rates are lower in those areas when
Right.
it's probably just the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've taken a lot of your time today, and I really appreciate it. The last question that I have for you before we close out today is, what can white people be doing right now during this point in time in history as white supremacy is rising and all of the issues that have been built into systematic racism and built in this country for years still persist? What can white people do to be better allies?
One, I would say if you're not able to ask Google, don't ask a black person because like 9 times out of 10, white people will say some pretty dumb things in like trying to make an argument about something. I think I told you about it, that the last shoot that I was on, this woman said to me, she was like, well, what all has Obama done for black people? Hello, a black man being president, obviously like showed a picture that like we could be something other than like, we could actually be elected officials. Hello. You know what I mean? That's like obvious, but like, okay, if you're not willing to Google that yourself, because you could Google it and Google would come up with all of the answers for you. And like, you know what I mean? Like, don't say things like that to a black person just to try to create an argument. And then the other thing I would think would be like to educate themselves. And on top of that, just to add to that, educating themselves, uh, the 13th Amendment, 13th is a really great documentary. If you like watching documentaries, The Grass is Greener is a really great documentary that also both on Netflix. And a really great book is The New Jim Crow. It does strictly focus on black men in America, and it doesn't really highlight black or Hispanic women or impoverished women in America. So it does focus mainly on black men, but I think that's like really also just both great starts to understanding what it is that black people consistently deal with on a regular basis, and how we are disenfranchised in this country. And then the last thing that I would actually say that could actually probably really help is to stop allowing people in your circle or in the workplace, or stop like giving a pass to racism. And even when they say it's just joking, like it's not joking. It's not a joke because like if it's not funny and nobody laughed, or even if some people did laugh, they shouldn't be because the shit's not funny. So I think that there's just that kind of thing where like we need to stop giving everybody like this okay to be racist, where it's like, oh well, it's just my grandfather who's old, he'll never really get it, or it's just like, oh well, they're stuck in their ways, or like they'll try to justify that like it's based off of their situational trauma. And no, you can't take away somebody's trauma. um like I think an example is when I saw this thing, and it was basically like this woman who she said she hated black men because she was raped by two young black men, and or assaulted. I'm sorry, not raped. She was just assaulted by two young black men, and that was like her like reason for like why she kind of like hated black people and like kind of had this whole like anger towards black people and this and that. And I said, well, the question is if it was two white kids, would you hate yourself? You know, and it's like, well, no, you probably wouldn't. So it's like, don't like try to like assume that like um, you can like categorize people based off of just what I mean, like their color, and stop trying to let people justify their actions or their hatred or their anger for their situational traumas. And that's really what I think is the most
Yeah,
long and short of it.
it's a really, really great point, a really, really important point to make. Thank you so, so, so much, Gabriel. We are so lucky to have been able to have this conversation today. And I think that this will hopefully put racism and racial trauma and all of these important topics that we talked about today into perspective for a lot of people and for those who are willing to listen and take action. So, so thankful for your time and appreciative of the opportunity to have this conversation with you, and also appreciative of you taking the time on the phone calls that we've had and the texts that I've sent you, like asking questions and asking you to help educate me, even though it's part of my responsibility to do that on my own, and I've been trying to take action to do it. So I'm so appreciative of you. It's not your responsibility to teach us to take the time to have these conversations.
And I think that's that's a part of it. We're friends, so I do enjoy having the conversation. Having the conversation for me helps to be able to talk it out, because talking it out is important. So that those types of questions, I think, are I personally always appreciate and warrant. Whereas, like, the other types of combative questions is what I'm mentioning, like, whereas, like, they don't need to happen. But I do appreciate you always asking and reaching out, mainly because I think it helps me, not just as much, but it also helps you to be able to reach or speak to a demographic of people that I would not be able to, because they wouldn't give me the time of day to listen to what I have to say based on the color of my skin. So you might be able to reach a group of white women who would kind of think twice about the fact that they're dating a literal Nazi, and say, instead of saying things like, well, we don't discuss politics, because I hear that a lot.
I hear that a lot too. I hear
Yeah,
that a lot.
yeah, yeah.
So thank you so much, Gabriel. And we will be in touch hopefully soon, and
Awesome. Yep.
excited to be your friend and excited to work with you, and just happy to have had this time today.
Same here.
Okay. Have a good one.
Thanks. You too.